Some men are two storms in one sky. One cold, one burning. And only one woman ever stood in the rain between them. Let the candle catch, and we begin our story now. The clock in the Slytherin common room had a flaw no one had ever fixed. At 11, it ticked true, but past midnight it stuttered, as if the castle itself grew uncertain of the hour. Draco had come to measure his life by that hitch in the rhythm. It was the sound of the change taking him. He did not remember the war doing this. He remembered the green light of a curse that had not been meant for him, the way the floor of the manor had risen to meet his cheek, the cold that had threaded itself behind his eyes and stayed. Healers had found nothing. His mother had wept over a son who seemed, by every test, entirely intact. Only he knew that something had been cut along a seam no instrument could see, and that the two raw edges did not always belong to the same person. By day he held. That took everything he had. The set of the jaw, the flat grey stare, the voice planned smooth of any warmth. These were not who he was. They were what he did. A performance rehearsed until the muscles ached. The day self lived inside walls. It turned the silver signet on its smallest finger when it wanted to feel the bite of an edge against skin, because the day self had decided long ago that feeling was a liability and pain at least could be controlled. But after midnight, the walls thinned. It came over him the way warmth returns to a frozen hand. First nothing, then the unbearable prickle of sensation flooding back. He would be sitting rigid in the green dark, every guard locked, and then the clock would stutter, and something behind his sternum would loosen by a single notch, and another, and he would feel his own shoulders drop, as if a hand he could not see had unclenched them. The cold receded. In its place came everything the cold had been holding down. He had never named the night self, because to name it would be to admit there were two of them, and that was a thing he could not yet survive admitting in daylight. But the night self knew the truth without flinching. It was him without the war. It was the boy who might have grown up gentle in some kinder version of the world, who noticed the way frost wrote its slow ferns across the lake window, who had wanted, once, before he understood that wanting was forbidden, simply to be liked. That boy could not bear the silence. So that boy had begun to write. The journal had been his grandmother's, black leather worn to the softness of skin, its pages thick with the tooth of old parchment that caught at the nib. He had taken it from a drawer one sleepless night with no plan beyond proof. Proof that the thing waking in him after dark was real, that it left a mark, that it was not merely the curse hollowing him out by degrees. He had pressed the quill down and written, "I am still here," and the ink had soaked into the page, and for a moment that had been enough. Then the page had answered. He still remembered the lurch of it weeks ago now, letters surfacing in a hand not his own, climbing up through the fibres of the parchment as though written on the underside of the same sheet by someone in another room. Another world. "So am I," the page had said, "whoever you are." He had nearly hurled the thing into the fire. Old, paired charm magic. He understood that much. Two journals enchanted as one, so that whatever was set in the one bled through to the other. A schoolgirl's toy, a way to pass notes across a dormitory. He had no idea who held the twin of his grandmother's book, no idea how it had come to be in some other hand. He told himself the not knowing was a danger. He told himself he would stop. He did not stop. Tonight, the fire had burned to a low red mutter, and the common room was empty, and the clock stuttered, and the change came, and Draco felt the night unlock him, rib by rib, until he could breathe in a way the daylight never let him. He drew the journal onto his knees. The leather was warm from being kept against him. He uncapped the ink, and the room filled with the faint, sharp scent of it, and his hand, which by day did not shake, which had been trained out of shaking, trembled once, lightly, as he set the nib to the page. "You're awake," he wrote. "I hoped you would be." The wait was the worst part and the best part. He watched the cream of the parchment and tried to picture nothing, because every time he let himself picture her, he built a different woman, and he had grown afraid of how dearly he wanted each one. Then the surface of the page seemed to ripple, the way still water remembers a dropped stone, and her hand rose into being beneath his. "I'm always awake," she wrote. "You know that by now. The castle doesn't let me sleep. Too many empty beds in it." Something in his chest folded inward. He pressed his thumb to the corner of the page as if he could press it to her. "The dead?" he wrote. "The dead," she answered. A pause, the ink hesitating. "And the ones who lived and came back wrong. I lie there, and I can hear the whole school not sleeping. It's a particular sound, did you know that? A building full of people pretending. You can feel it through the stone. I know that sound," he wrote, and meant it so completely that his eyes stung. "I make it too." He had never told her his name. She had never given hers. That had been the unspoken law of the thing from the first night, that they would be only two voices in the dark, stripped of the names that would have made them enemies or strangers, free to be honest in a way names never permitted. He did not let himself wonder who she was. The wondering was a door he kept his shoulder against. "Tell me something true," she wrote. Her ritual, the way she opened every night, as though truth were a lamp they lit between them. Something you couldn't say in daylight. The fire popped. Far off, a portrait muttered in its sleep. Draco looked at the question and felt the whole architecture of his daytime self stand between him and the answer. And then he watched himself walk past it, because here, only here, he was permitted to. In the daylight, he wrote slowly, "I am someone I despise. I say cruel things because cruelty is the only language they taught me to be fluent in. People look at me and they see what I let them see, and it's a lie. And I keep the lie up because if I stopped, if I let them see the rest, I don't think I'd survive what they do with it. So I'm cold. I'm exactly as cold as they expect, and it's killing me by inches, and I can't stop, and the only hour I am ever myself is this one, with you, where no one can find me." He did not breathe while her answer formed. "I think," she wrote, "that I've been waiting my whole life to read those exact words from someone, because I do it too, not the cruelty, but the armor. They've made me into a symbol, brave, clever, unbreakable Granger." The hand stopped. Draco's heart stopped with it. The names sat in the ink between them like a struck match. She had not meant to write it. He could see the small, frantic blot where the quill had pressed too hard, where she had startled at her own slip. Granger, the whole long, careful anonymity of them undone by a single careless syllable. And the night self, the unguarded self, the self that had spent weeks falling without ever once asking whose hand it fell toward, sat in the green dark of the Slytherin common room, and understood, all at once, with a horror that was almost indistinguishable from joy, exactly who had been keeping him alive. Hermione Granger, the girl his other self had spent 6 years teaching himself to hate. The girl Draco passed in the corridors with a flat grey stare and a curl of the lip. The girl whose hand he had seen tighten white around her wand only that morning when he'd said something he could no longer even remember. Some reflexive venom the daylight produced in him as easily as breath. That Granger, the one his whole inheritance had been built to despise. He had told her he despised who he was in daylight. He had not known, when he wrote it, that the person he despised in daylight despised her, that the two truths were the same truth wearing different faces, and that both of those faces were his. The quill hung suspended over the page. A drop of ink swelled at its tip, trembled and fell, blooming into a dark star on the parchment beside her unfinished word. On the other side of the bond, in some tower room he could now picture far too clearly, she would be staring at her own slip with her heart in her throat, waiting to see whether the stranger she trusted would recoil, would mock her, would vanish. She would be straightening something. He knew it without knowing how, smoothing an already smooth blanket, pressing the heel of her hand flat against the page as if she could push the name back down into it. Draco set the nib to the parchment. He had no plan. The night self never had a plan. That was the whole terrible freedom of it. He only knew that the cold was coming back. He could feel the first thin thread of it sliding behind his eyes. The clock past its stutter now, the hour turning. And that, in a few minutes, the daylight man would have this memory and would not know what to do with it, would wake tomorrow knowing that the only voice that had ever reached him in the dark belonged to the one girl he was forbidden, by blood and by habit, and by every wound the war had left, to ever let himself want. He pressed the quill down. The ink met the page, and as the first letter took shape, the cold closed over him like water over a sinking stone, and the journal slid from his slackening fingers to the floor, falling open to the page where her name and his unfinished answer lay side by side in the dying firelight. Neither of them yet aware that the man she loved in the dark and the man she hated in the light had only ever had one heart between them. Morning came to the castle like a verdict. Draco woke in his own bed with no memory of having walked to it. This was the cruelty of the scene. The night self surrendered him to sleep, and the day self inherited the body cold, the way one inherits a house after a death, rooms rearranged by a stranger, objects moved, the faint sense that someone had been living here who was not you. He lay rigid beneath the green hangings and felt the cold settle into its accustomed places, behind the eyes, along the jaw, in the hinge of every word he would speak today. And beneath the cold, like a stone under ice, sat a memory that did not belong to the man now wearing his face. Granger. He knew it the way one knows a thing learned in fever, without the path that led to the knowing. He had a recollection of ink and firelight, and a name surfacing through parchment, and the recollection arrived wrapped in an emotion the day self had no shelf to put it on. Tenderness toward her. The day Draco sat up sharply, and his hand found the silver signet and turned it hard until the edge bit a clean line of pain into the soft skin below his knuckle. Pain, he understood. Pain had a flaw to it. This other thing had none. He found the journal on the common room floor where the knight had dropped it. He had not known until this morning that the knight self wrote. He had suspected. There had been mornings he woke with ink ghosting the side of his hand, a smell of it on his fingers. But he had filed the suspicion away unexamined, the way he filed everything that threatened the architecture of the day. Now he stood over the open book in the grey wash of early light and read what the two of them had written, and his stomach turned over. He read the line where the night self had confessed the armour. I am someone I despise. He read it in his own hand and felt the accuracy of it land like a blow he had thrown at himself. And he read her answer, the slip, the name, and below it a single unfinished letter, the start of whatever the night self had been writing when the change took him. An eye with a downstroke trailing off into nothing where the quill had fallen. The day self closed the journal with both hands, slowly, as though shutting a coffin. His knuckles stood out white against the black leather. He had spent 6 years building a wall between himself and Hermione Granger. Every sneer had been a brick. The wall was the most reliable thing he owned. And the night, the soft, traitorous, unguarded night, had been quietly dismantling it from the other side, brick by brick, with a quill, while he slept. The girl he had trained himself to despise had been keeping the despised half of him alive. The symmetry of it was so cruel he almost laughed, except that the day self did not laugh. The day self only turned the ring. He told himself he would burn the journal. He did not burn the journal. He slid it inside his robes, against his ribs, where the night self had kept it. And he did not let himself wonder why his own hands betrayed him. And he went up to breakfast wearing the cold, like a man pulling a coat tight against a wind only he could feel. She was at the Gryffindor table with her back half turned, and Draco's whole body registered her before his mind gave permission. He saw the curve of her shoulder, the way she held her quill even at breakfast, as if a thought might need catching, the particular fierce concentration she gave to the simplest things. The day self looked at her, and the old reflex rose up automatic and venomous. Granger, Swat, Mudblood, beneath you. Hate her. You have always hated her. And underneath the reflex, for the first time in 6 years, something refused to agree. It was the night's residue. It would not be argued down. He hated that more than he had ever hated her. She must have felt the weight of his stare, because she turned, and for one unguarded instant their eyes met across the hall, and Draco saw her face do something complicated. Wariness first, the old expectation of cruelty, braced for. Then, beneath it, a flicker of something she could not have named, because she did not know its source. The particular searching look of a person who has been turning over a stranger's words all night and is studying every face for a seam where the stranger might show through. She did not know she was looking at him. She only knew that lately she searched faces, and his caught her, and she did not understand why. The day self's mouth opened. The day self was built to say something that would close the moment like a fist. He felt the sentence loading, some clean cold cruelty about her hair, or her blood, or her dead, the daily venom his inheritance produced as easily as spit. And he could not say it. The words were there. The reflex was there. But the night had left a thumbprint on him, and where the cruelty should have launched, there was instead a single held breath, and then nothing. A silence that stretched a half-second too long. A silence that was itself a kind of confession. Hermione's eyes narrowed faintly, reading the strangeness of it. Draco shut his mouth, looked away, and turned the ring beneath the table until it hurt. He left breakfast without eating. That night, the cold did not loosen on schedule. The day self sat alone in the emptied common room and fought it. He understood now what the journal was, what the night did with it, who the night reached for. And the day self had decided, coldly, deliberately in the safe grey hours, that it would not happen again. He would stay awake. He would stay himself. He would hold the seam shut by will alone and deny the soft half its midnight and its quill and its Granger. He gripped the arms of the chair and stared into the fire and waited for the clock to stutter, certain that this time he would meet the hour standing. The clock stuttered, and he felt the change begin, and he fought it. And it was like trying to hold back the tide with the flat of his hand. The warmth came creeping up from his sternum, and his shoulders ached to drop, and the cold behind his eyes thinned and thinned. But this time, for the first time, the day self did not simply dissolve into sleep before the night arrived. This time, fighting, awake, gripping the chair with whitening knuckles, he stayed conscious across the seam. And for a handful of unbearable seconds, two men occupied one body at once. It was the worst thing he had ever felt. It was like standing in a doorway and being on both sides of it. He felt the cold and the warmth at the same time, the contempt and the tenderness braided into a single impossible strand, and a voice that was his and not his rose up behind his own thoughts, clear as a second heartbeat. "Let me write to her," the knight said, from inside him. "You don't have to understand it. Just let me have the hour." "She's Granger," the day answered, and his own lip curled around the name even in the silence of his skull. "I know exactly who she is," the knight said, and there was no contempt in it at all, only something steady and terrible and certain. "I knew before you did. I was the one awake when she told me." The day self's hand had already drawn the journal from his robes. He watched it happen as if from a height, his own fingers uncapping the ink, the sharp, clean scent rising. He fought it. He pressed his nails into his palm hard enough to break the skin. And still the hand moved, because the night was stronger here, in this hour, on this ground, and the day could only watch and seethe as his own quill descended toward the page. But this time, the day did not lose the body entirely. This time, half present, half drowned, the day self could read what the knight wrote. And, with a jolt that felt like falling, the day self discovered he could push the quill too. The knight wrote, "I'm sorry I disappeared last night. Something took me before I could answer. I'm here now." Her hand surfaced almost at once, fast, relieved, and the relief in it pierced both of them at once. "You frightened me. You started to say something, and then there was nothing. All night nothing. and I thought, I don't know what I thought, that I'd ruined it, that writing my name had... You ruined nothing, the knight wrote. And then, the day self, fighting up through the warmth like a drowning man breaking the surface, seized the quill with everything he had and wrote, in the same hand, on the same page, in a voice colder by a full degree, a voice she would later swear she could feel the temperature of. Who are you, really? You hide behind this book. So do I. One of us should have the courage to stop. The two sentences sat on the page one beneath the other, the warmth and the chill, the open hand and the closed one. And on the other side of the bond, Hermione Granger went very still. She read them twice. She read them 3 times. Because she had been writing to one man for weeks, and tonight, suddenly, impossibly, there were 2 voices in the ink. The gentle one she had been falling toward in the dark, and a second one, sharper, guarded, almost hostile, surfacing right behind it like a face behind a face. And she could not tell, would have no way to tell, that both of them had picked up the same quill. She bent over her journal in the tower, and the day self felt the night self strain against him for the quill. And the 2 of them locked there in one trembling hand, neither yielding, the ink swelling black at the nib above the page where she had begun, in a small, unsteady script, to write back. Hermione had read once that grief and love produced the same symptoms. The sleeplessness, the appetite that came and went, the way the mind circled a single point until the point wore a groove. She had not believed it then. She believed it now, at 3 in the morning, sitting cross-legged on her bed in the 8th year tower, with the journal open on her knees and 2 voices warring inside it. Who are you, really? The second voice had written. One of us should have the courage to stop. She had read it until the words came apart into shapes. The handwriting was the same. That was the thing she could not get past. The same long, controlled strokes, the same backward lean to the letters, the same way the crossbar of the T-dit came down hard, as if the writer were pressing a point. The same hand. And yet the 2 messages could not have come from the same person. One had spent weeks unspooling its tenderness into the dark for her, careful and aching and kind. The other had appeared tonight like cold water flung in her face, guarded, suspicious, demanding she unmask herself while offering nothing. She told herself the simplest explanation. He is 2 people, not literally. But the way the war made so many of us 2 people, the one who survived and the one who's furious at having had to. She knew that doubling intimately. There was the Hermione who answered to her name in daylight, brave and clever and unbreakable, the girl the prophet called a heroine. And there was the one who lay awake listening to a castle full of people pretending to sleep, who had not cried since the battle and was beginning to be frightened by the fact. She of all people understood a man at war with the halves of himself, so she did not recoil from the cold voice. She bent over the page and she answered it, both of them at once, because she could not tell them apart well enough to choose. You're right, she wrote. I do hide. I write to you because here I don't have to be the person they've decided I am. Here I can be afraid out loud. You asked who I am. I'll tell you one true thing, and you'll have to be content with it. I am someone who has spent months being brave for other people, and the only place I've been allowed to stop is on this page, with you. Both of you, apparently. Because tonight there are two of you, aren't there? Don't tell me I'm imagining it. The reply came slowly, and she would have sworn she felt, a struggle in the slowness, as if the quill on the other end were being fought for. The warm voice surfaced first. You're not imagining it. I don't know how to explain what I am, only that the gentleness is real. Believe that, even when the other... The line broke, and then the colder hand, climbing up right behind it, sharp and clean. Even when the other tells you the truth. He'll give you comfort. I'll give you honesty. You're clever enough to know which one keeps you safe. Hermione stared at the two of them stacked on the page, gentleness and steel, and her heart did a thing she had no word for, and her hand reached without her permission to smooth the already smooth blanket beside her knee, over and over, the flat of her palm pressing the wool down as though something in the room had come loose and needed holding still. Why, she wrote, and her own quill was not quite steady, does the honest one sound so afraid? There was no answer for a long time, long enough that she thought she had lost them both. Then a single line surfaced, and she could not have said which voice it belonged to, because it had neither warmth nor chill in it, only something raw, something that seemed to have escaped through a crack in both of them at once. Because the honest one knows who you are, and knowing it costs more than you can possibly understand. Then the page went still, and stayed still, and no amount of waiting brought either of them back. She found him 3 times the next day, and each time it was an accident, and each time it was not. The first was in the library. She had not gone looking for Malfoy. She had gone looking, in the way she now searched every room, for the seam where her stranger might show through, because the line "the honest one knows who you are" had lodged in her like a splinter and worked its way deeper with every hour. It meant her stranger was here, in the castle. Someone who walked these corridors knew her by sight and wrote to her by night. She had begun, helplessly, to study faces. Malfoy was at a table in the restricted section's shadow, a book open before him that he was not reading. He was turning the silver ring on his smallest finger, around and around, his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the particular blankness of a person whose thoughts are very far from where their body sits. Hermione's own thoughts snagged on the sight before she could stop them. He looks like a man being held together from the outside. She pushed the observation down. It was Malfoy. She did not spare Malfoy her sympathy. That ledger had been settled years ago in blood, and she moved to pass him. He looked up. Their eyes met. And again, as at breakfast the day before, his mouth opened on some practiced cruelty, and again, nothing came. Only that strange held silence, that half-second too long, his jaw working around a sentence that would not launch. Hermione found herself stopped in the aisle, looking at him, waiting, and not knowing for what. "Say it then," she heard herself murmur. "Whatever it is, you always do." Something crossed his face, there and gone, fast as weather. For just an instant the flat grey went out of his eyes, and behind it she saw something she had absolutely no frame for. A kind of stricken recognition, as if he were looking not at the girl in the aisle, but at someone he knew far better, and was not permitted to know at all. "I have nothing to say to you, Granger," he said, but the voice did not match the words. The words were a closed fist. The voice came out a half-tone too low, a half-second too gentle, and she heard it, heard the crack the way one hears a wrong note in a familiar song, and her pulse did something abrupt and absurd, and she walked away fast with her ears ringing and told herself it meant nothing. It meant nothing. It could not possibly mean what some impossible part of her had begun to suspect it meant. That night, the journal stayed shut on her knees for an hour before she could open it, because she had begun to add it up, and the sum frightened her. The same hand in the ink, the held silences in the corridor, the voice that came out wrong when he tried to be cruel. The honest one knows who you are. Each piece on its own was nothing. Together, they pointed somewhere she refused to let them point, because if they were right, then she had spent weeks laying her unguarded heart open to Draco Malfoy, had told him her fears and her sleeplessness and the loneliness she let no one else see, had been falling. There was no longer any honest word for it but falling, toward the boy who had called her a slur in this very castle, whose aunt had carved one into her arm. She opened the journal because not opening it was worse. "I have to ask you something," she wrote, "and I need you to answer it without hiding behind whichever of you is braver tonight. Do I know you? In daylight? Have I looked at your face and not known it was you?" The weight stretched so long the candle guttered. Then the warm hand surfaced, slow, and she was certain she could feel, that it was writing against resistance, that the cold one was pulling the other way with all its strength, and that for once the gentleness was winning, was saying the thing the steel would have died before saying. "Yes," the page said. "You know me? You've looked at my face 100 times and seen everything you were trained to hate and none of what I am. And if I tell you my name tonight, you'll close this book and never open it again, and I will lose the only hour I have ever been myself. So I am asking you, please, not to ask me to say it yet." Hermione read it with her hand pressed flat against her own throat. The candle threw the shadow of the quill huge against the wall, trembling, and far below in the green dark of the dungeons, a clock stuttered past midnight, and in the tower she lifted her quill to write the name herself, to set it down on the page and end the not knowing forever. And her hand hovered there above the parchment, the ink swelling at the nib, unable to fall. She did not write the name. Hermione held the quill over the parchment until the swelling drop of ink fell of its own weight and bloomed dark on the page, and then she set the quill down and pressed both hands flat against the journal as if it might rise off her knees and float away. Not yet. He had asked her for not yet, and she had granted it, and she did not fully understand why, except that the alternative, to write Malfoy and watch the words sit there in cold black certainty, felt like killing something with her own hand. The gentle voice in the dark had become, over these weeks, the truest companion she had. She was not ready to learn it had been wearing a face she'd spent 6 years learning to hate. So she chose the not knowing a little longer, and hated herself a little for choosing it, and slept at last near dawn with the book held against her chest. Below, in the dungeons, neither half of Draco slept at all. the seam was failing. The day self understood it first, because the day self was the one who kept the accounts. For weeks, the change had come at midnight and lifted at the small dead hours, and the body had been handed cleanly between them. Now the handoffs frayed. He woke mid-morning with the night's tenderness still warm in him and had to claw the cold back into place by force. He sat through lessons and felt the warmth try to surface in broad daylight at the wrong hour on the wrong ground. Felt his own guarded face threaten to soften in front of people who would take the softening as weakness and feed on it. He gripped the ring. He gripped his wand until the wood creaked. The two of them, day and night, were no longer taking turns. They were bleeding into each other, and the bleeding hurt in a way he had no language for. A slow tearing along the seam where the curse had cut him, as if the wound were trying either to close or to open all the way, and could not decide which. That night, for the first time, they spoke to each other directly. It happened in the changing hour, in that unbearable doorway moment when both of them held the body at once. The day self had stopped fighting the change. Fighting it only worsened the tearing, and so for a long stretched minute he hung suspended in his own skull beside the other, and the other was there, fully present, and there was nowhere left to hide from him. "You love her," the day said. It was not an accusation. It was a man naming a catastrophe. "Yes," the night said. "She's Granger." "I know what she is," the night said, steady. "She's the only person who's ever known me. The real me. The one you spend every daylight hour burying alive. She doesn't know my name, and she loves me anyway. Do you understand what that is? Do you understand that no one in my entire life has loved the thing under the armor because no one has ever been allowed to see it?" The day self was silent. And in the silence, this was the unbearable part, the part he would spend the rest of the night trying to deny. The day self understood that he loved her too. Not the night's love. The day's love was a colder country, hard and reluctant and furious at itself. But it was there, and it had been there since the morning he could not say the cruel thing at breakfast, since the library when his own voice betrayed him on her name. The day self loved her the way ice loves the thing it's freezing around, gripping, possessive, terrified. He loved her because she had reached the despised half and kept it alive, and the day self, for all its contempt, did not want the despised half to die. Which meant he saw now with a clarity that felt like a blade that he did not want to die either, because the night self was not separate from him. The night self was what he would have been. The night self was the boy the war had not yet reached, preserved in him like a body in ice, and every cruelty the day self performed was a shovelful of earth thrown over that boy's living face. "If she ever chooses," the day said slowly, "she chooses you, not me. No one chooses the cold one." "That's not true," the night said, and there was something almost like grief in it. "She's been writing to both of us for days now, both voices, the warm one and the sharp one, and she hasn't closed the book. She asked the sharp one why it sounded afraid. She's not choosing between us. She's the only person alive who's looked at the whole of you, the steel and the rest, and stayed. You've been so busy hating yourself, you never noticed she didn't." The day self had no answer for that. The cold came down then and took the body, and the night sank under, and Draco was alone again in the single self that was never whole. But something had shifted in him. Some small, load-bearing belief had cracked, and through the crack came a thought so dangerous he turned the ring until it drew blood to keep from following it. What if I don't have to choose which of me she gets? What if the whole point is that I'm supposed to be one man? She came to him the next day, on purpose this time, no pretense of accident. She found him on the covered walk above the courtyard, where the rebuilt arches still smelled of new-cut stone, where a thin rain came slanting in to darken the flags. He was alone, watching the rain, the ring going around and around his finger. Hermione stopped a few feet off, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the rain filled the silence with its small, ceaseless percussion on the stone. "You don't sleep either," she said finally. Not a question. The ring stopped turning. He did not look at her. "What would you know about how I sleep, Granger?" "Nothing," she said, "except that I've started to recognize the look of people who don't. You've got it. The whole castle's got it. I've got it." She came a step closer into the lee of the arch, out of the rain. "I've been writing to someone," she heard herself say, and could not believe she was saying it, but the not saying had become unbearable. "At night, for weeks, someone in this castle. He won't tell me his name. And lately I've started to think—" She stopped. His knuckles had gone white where his hand gripped the stone balustrade. He still would not look at her. "Think what?" he said, and his voice did the thing again. The wrong note, the half-tone too low, the crack she now knew by heart. "That I'd know him if he turned around," she said softly. The rain came down. A long moment unspooled between them, taut as a wire, and Hermione watched the side of his face and saw the muscle leap in his jaw, saw him fighting something with his whole rigid body, and she understood, all at once, with a certainty that left her breathless, that she was right, that she had been right for days, that the man who would not tell her his name and the man gripping the stone beside her with bleeding knuckles were the same man, and that he knew she knew, and that they were both standing on the edge of the same cliff with their backs to each other, neither willing to be the one who turned. "Look at me," she said. His shoulders rose with a breath he could not seem to release. "Malfoy," she said, the name at last, soft as the rain, neither a weapon nor an accusation, only true. "Look at me." And slowly, with the look of a man stepping willingly off a height, Draco Malfoy turned his head, and the rain blurred the courtyard behind them to silver, and his grey eyes came up and found hers, and in them, for the space of a single heartbeat, she saw both of them at once, the cold and the warm, the steel and the boy, looking out of the same face at the one person who had ever seen all the way down. And his mouth opened to say the thing that would end the not knowing forever, and got as far as the first soft syllable of her name. Hermione. He had never said it before. 6 years, and he had said Granger 1,000 ways, sneered it, spat it, weaponized it. But he had never once said her given name, and it came out of him now in the rain like something pried loose from very deep, and she heard in the single word both voices he had ever used in the ink, the warmth and the steel braided into one breath, and she understood with her whole body that there was no longer any question to ask. She had her answer. She had had it for days. It was standing in front of her with rain in its hair and blood on its knuckles, and it had just spoken her name as though the name cost him something he could barely afford. "It was you," she said. "The whole time. It was me." He did not look away now, though she could see what it took. "Both of me. The one who—" He stopped. The jaw worked. "There are two of me, Granger. Hermione. There's a curse. The war." The words came out broken, in pieces, nothing like the fluent cold of the daylight man or the unspooling tenderness of the night. Just a man trying to tell the truth without an instrument built for it. "By day, I'm what you've always seen, what you've had every right to hate. And at night, something else wakes up. The one who wrote to you. The one who—" He shut his eyes. "I didn't know it was you. The night self didn't know. We wrote to a voice in the dark for weeks before you let your name slip, and by then it was— I was already— Already what?" she said. He opened his eyes. "Already gone," he said simply. "Both of me. Over you. Which is the cruelest joke the war ever played, and it played a great many." The rain came down between them and around them, and Hermione stood very still and let the impossible thing arrange itself into something she could hold. She was a person who needed to understand the mechanism of a thing before she could believe it. And so even now, even here, the clever part of her was already working. Split consciousness, a dark curse, the seam between the selves, the journal a paired charm he used to prove he still existed. And the understanding did not cool what she felt. It did the opposite. Because she saw, with the swift, terrible clarity that had carried her through a war, exactly what it meant that he was two men, and what it would cost him to stay that way. "How long," she said, "have the two of you been bleeding into each other?" His head came up sharply. "How did you—" "Because I've been reading both of you on the same page for days," she said. At the start, there was only the warm one. Now there are two voices in one entry fighting for the same quill. A curse that splits a consciousness clean wouldn't do that. The seam's failing, isn't it? The halves are tearing. She watched his face confirm it before he said a word. "Malfoy, a soul isn't meant to be cut in two and held that way. The magic that's keeping you split, it's not stable. It can't be. Either it heals, or it—" She did not finish, because she had seen the answer arrive in his eyes before she reached it. "Or it finishes the cut," he said quietly. "Yes, I worked that out a fortnight ago. One of me eventually wins. The other—" He turned the ring once, slowly. "The healers found nothing because there was nothing to find. You can't put a body on a table and show it the place where a man stopped being one person." "Which one wins?" she said, and her voice was not steady. "I don't know." He looked out at the rain. The day self is stronger. He's had years of practice at holding the body. The night only gets the dead hours. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile. "So, if you're asking which of us survives, it's the one you hate, the cold one. The one who said the unforgivable things in this castle. He lives, and the one you've been—" His voice failed on it. "The one you wrote to. He goes quiet, slowly, and then he doesn't wake." Hermione found she had stopped breathing. The arithmetic of it was monstrous. The man she had fallen toward in the dark, the gentle one, the only true companion her sleepless months had given her. That one was dying, was being slowly throttled by the very armor she'd spent 6 years on the wrong end of. And the one who would live was the one she had every reason to want dead. Except that she had been writing to both of them for days now and had not closed the book. Except that the cold voice, the sharp one, the one that demanded she unmask herself, had also been the one to ask, "Do I know you? Have you looked at my face and not known it?" No, that had been the warm one. But the cold one had written, "The honest one knows who you are, and knowing it costs more than you can understand." And that was not the voice of a man who felt nothing. That was the voice of a man drowning in feeling and furious at himself for it. "You're wrong," she said. He looked at her. "You keep talking about them as two men, the warm one and the cold one, the one I love and the one I hate." She took a step toward him, out into the rain now, not caring, the cold water soaking through her shoulders. "But I've read both of you on the same page, and it's the same hand, Malfoy, the same handwriting. You never noticed that, did you? You write identically, day and night, because you are one person. The curse didn't make two men out of you. It just..." She groped for it. "It cut you along a line that was already there, the line every one of us has. The self we're allowed to show and the self we keep buried. The war did to you, with a curse, what it did to the rest of us with silence. It split you, but the pieces were always yours, both of them, the steel and the boy. There's no version of you that's only one of them. The cold one isn't a separate man who lives while the other dies. He's half a person, and so is the night. Neither of them is you. You're the both of them, and you've been killing yourself trying to keep them apart." He had gone very still. "You said no one chooses the cold one," she said, and watched him flinch, because she was quoting something he had only ever thought, something he had written to himself, something he had no memory of saying aloud to her and could not understand how she knew. But she didn't know he hadn't said it. She had read it. The night had written it in the journal one bleak hour, and the day had never seen. "You're wrong about that too. I don't want one of you to win, Malfoy. I don't want the warm one to survive and the cold one to die any more than the reverse. I want..." Her voice cracked clean across. "I want the whole of you, steel and all. I want the one who's afraid and the one who's cruel, because being cruel was the only safety he was ever taught. I've been falling for a man I thought was two people, and it turns out he was one all along, and I don't want half of him. I want him whole. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The rain ran down his face. He did not move to wipe it. "You can't want that," he said, very low. "You don't know what the daylight one has done, what he is." "I know exactly what he is. He stood in this castle and called me things that left a scar I'll carry till I die." She lifted her chin. "And I'm standing here in the rain telling you I want him whole anyway, because the gentle one I've been falling for is made of the same self, and I will not love half a man and let the other half die in the dark. So you don't get to give him to me, Malfoy. You don't get to hand me the version you think I can stomach and bury the rest. It's all of you or none. That's the only terms I'll take." For a long moment he simply looked at her, and the rain came down, and the rebuilt arches dripped, and somewhere far off the bell counted an hour neither of them heard. And then something happened in his face that she had never seen there in 6 years. The cold did not vanish, and the warmth did not flood in. But for the first time, the two of them stopped fighting for the territory of his expression and simply coexisted, the steel and the boy looking out of one face at once, and she realized she was seeing, for the very first time, the whole of him. "It's tearing me apart," he said. "Literally. The seam. Every day it gives a little more. I don't have long. Weeks, maybe less, before one of them wins and the other." His hand had begun to shake. He closed it around the balustrade. "If there's a way to make me one man again, Granger, I don't know it. The curse work that did this was meant to kill. The splitting was an accident, a body fighting not to die. There's no counter-curse for an accident." "Then we find one," she said. "I'm rather good at finding things." He let out a breath that was almost, nearly, the ghost of a laugh. And the sound of it, that small, broken, almost laugh, undid something in her chest. She reached out before she could think better of it, and laid her hand over his where it gripped the wet stone, over the white knuckles and the small, bright line of blood the ring had drawn. And at her touch, his whole body went rigid as struck iron, and his eyes came up to hers wide and stricken. And she felt, beneath her palm, the tremor that ran through him, the seam itself shuddering at the contact, both halves of him straining at once toward the single point where her skin met his. He did not pull his hand away. That was the thing Hermione would remember afterward. Not the tremor that went through him, not the way his eyes blew wide, but that Draco Malfoy, who had spent 6 years recoiling from her as if her blood might burn him, did not pull his hand away. He stood rigid as struck iron beneath her palm and let her touch him, and she felt the seam in him shudder under her fingers like a plucked string. And for one suspended moment, the rain and the arches and the ruined courtyard fell away, and there was only the small warm point where her skin met his, and the way his breath had stopped. Then the bell finished its count, and the spell of it broke, and he drew his hand back, gently, not the old recoil, but as if removing it cost him, and pressed it flat against his own chest, as though to keep the warmth she'd left there from escaping. "You shouldn't touch me," he said. His voice had gone low and rough. "When the seam's like this, I don't know which of me you're touching, or whether the touching makes it worse." "It didn't feel worse," she said. "No." He looked at her, and there it was again, both of them at once behind the grey. It didn't. She did not find the answer in the library. She had known somewhere that she wouldn't. The curse that had cut him was older and darker than anything the Hogwarts shelves would hold, and the splitting had been, as he'd said, an accident of a body refusing to die, which meant there was no neat countercharm filed under S for souls. But Hermione Granger did not need a book to tell her a thing she had already reasoned her way toward in the rain. She needed only to be brave enough to believe her own conclusion. She found it instead in the way the two of them wrote to her that night. Because she went back to the journal, she could not stay away from it, even now, even knowing. And she wrote to both of them at once, openly now, no longer pretending she didn't know whose hand held the quill. "Malfoy," she wrote. "Both of you. I know who you are now, and I'm still here. I want you to do something. I want the day self and the night self to write me a single sentence together. Not one, and then the other. The same sentence, both of you driving the quill. Can you do that? The wait was very long. She could picture it, the two of them locked in the one trembling hand, neither yielding, the way she'd seen the doubled entries fight each other across the page for days. She had asked them to do the one thing the curse had made impossible, to agree. The quill touched the parchment. It moved in fits, a letter at a time, stopping, starting, the strokes wavering as though written in a high wind. And slowly, agonizingly, a single sentence climbed up through the page in the same long, backward-leaning hand they shared. We don't want to be two men anymore. Hermione pressed her fingers to her mouth. We, both of them, one sentence. The first thing the halves of him had ever said in a single voice. And she understood, looking at it, that she had been right in the rain, more right than she dared hope. The cure was not a countercurse at all. The seam was failing because the two halves were straining apart, each fighting for the body, each certain the other was the enemy. But the moment they wanted the same thing, the moment they stopped warring for territory and reached together for the same future, the seam had something to close around. A soul couldn't be sewn shut by magic. It could only be sewn shut by the man choosing, with both halves at once, to be one person. And both halves, she now knew, wanted the same single thing. They wanted her. She wrote to him, "Meet me, tonight, the astronomy tower at the changing hour. Bring the journal." Why the changing hour, came the answer, sharp, the day self, wary even now. "Because that's the only time you're ever both awake at once," she wrote, "and I need both of you there. Trust me." A pause. Then, in the warm hand, "I've trusted you with everything I am, both halves of it. I'm not going to stop now." The tower was cold and high and open to the night, and the rain had cleared to leave the sky scoured and enormous, stars flung across it in their thousands, the kind of sky that made the war feel for a moment like a thing that had happened to other, smaller people. Hermione got there first. She stood at the parapet with the wind pulling at her hair and waited, and the fear in her was real, because she did not actually know if this would work. She had reasoned it out, but reasoning was not the same as certainty. And if she was wrong, if she had called him here at the most dangerous hour of his cursed day, and the seam chose this moment to finish its long, slow cut, then she would watch him torn apart in front of her, and it would be because she had asked him to come. He came up the stairs slowly. She heard him before she saw him, the hollow echo of footfalls climbing, and then he was there in the starlight, pale and drawn, the journal held against his ribs, and she could see at once that the hour was already on him. He moved like a man walking against a current. His hands shook. The seam was loud in him tonight. She could almost see it. The two of him surfacing and sinking by turns across his own face, the cold rising and the warmth rising, neither winning, both exhausted. "This is the worst hour to make me climb a tower," he said, and his voice fractured halfway through the sentence, the day's chill giving way to the night's softness mid-breath. I can't hold them apart much longer, Granger. Tonight it's bad. Tonight I think it might." He stopped, steadied himself against the wall. "Why are we here?" "Because I worked it out," she said. "The cure. There isn't a counter-curse. There was never going to be one. The seam's failing, Because both halves of you are fighting to survive, each one trying to win the body before the other does. As long as you're at war with yourself, the cut keeps tearing. But the moment you both want the same thing, the same future, with your whole heart, both halves of it, there's nothing left to tear. You stop being two men pulling apart and become one man reaching forward. You don't fight your way back to whole, Malfoy. You choose it. Both of you at once. And it only works if the thing you both want is real enough, large enough, to hold the two halves together. He stared at her. The wind moved between them. And what, he said very quietly, do you imagine both halves of me want that badly? I read it tonight, she said. In your own hand. We don't want to be two men anymore. But that's not enough on its own. Wanting to stop being two isn't the same as wanting to be one towards something. She made herself hold his gaze. I think both of you want me. The night self has loved me in the dark for weeks, and the day self. Her voice wavered. The day self couldn't say a cruel word to me at breakfast, couldn't make his own voice come out cold in the library. Wrote the honest one knows who you are, and knowing it costs more than you can understand. That's not hate, Malfoy. That's a man drowning. Both of you want the same thing. You've just never been allowed to want it at the same time. His knuckles had gone white on the parapet. And if you're wrong, he said, if you've called me here at the hour, I'm most likely to come apart, and the two of me reach for you and find we want different things after all. You'll watch it happen. The tearing. You'll be the last thing one of me ever sees. I'm not wrong, she said. But her own voice shook on it, and he heard. He laughed then, a real one this time, low and ragged and disbelieving, and it broke the rigid line of him. And for a moment, she saw the boy the war hadn't reached looking out of the man it had. You're the most maddening person I have ever known, he said. You've reasoned out the salvation of my soul on a tower at midnight, and you're standing there frightened. You got the workings wrong. I'm always frightened I got the workings wrong, she said. It's why I check them so many times. He took a step toward her. The seam shuddered through him visibly. He gritted his teeth against it and kept coming until there was almost nothing left between them but the cold tower air and the long-held breath of 6 years. Then let's check it, he said. And he reached up, both hands, both halves of him, the steel and the boy moving together for the first time in his life toward the single thing they had each been reaching for alone, and cupped her face, and Hermione felt the tremor in his palms, felt the seam in him straining at the contact, both of him rising at once to the surface of his own skin, and his eyes searched hers in the starlight, as if to ask whether she was certain, whether she truly meant all of him, the cruel and the kind, the dark and the light. And she answered without a word, lifting her own hands to cover his, holding both halves of him against her face, and watched the question in his eyes become something else entirely as he began, slowly, to lean down toward her. He stopped a breath away. Hermione felt the warmth of him, the unsteadiness of his hands against her jaw, the seam in him shuddering so hard now that she could feel it travel through his palms into her own skin. And she understood that he had stopped not out of doubt, but out of terror, that he was a man standing at the lip of the one thing he wanted most and most believed himself unworthy of, and that he could not make himself close the last inch alone. So she closed it for him. She rose onto the balls of her feet and pressed her mouth to his, and for one suspended instant nothing happened. He went rigid, all of him, as if the contact had frozen him through. And then a sound broke out of him, low and helpless, a sound she had never heard a person make, and he kissed her back. And the seam in him caught fire. She felt it. There was no other word. Beneath her hands, his face went hot, and the tremor that had been running through him in fits and starts gathered all at once into a single deep shudder, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was the moment, that she had been right and she had been wrong, both at once. Right that wanting the same thing would close the cut, wrong to imagine it would be gentle. The two halves of him were rushing toward the same point, toward her, toward the kiss, toward the future they both wanted. And the rushing was violent, was the whole torn architecture of him slamming back together along a line that had been held open for 2 years. He made a sound against her mouth that was almost a cry, and his hands fisted in her hair, and for a terrible moment she thought she had killed him. After all, that the tearing had won, that she would feel him come apart under her hands. His knees gave. She caught him. They sank together to the cold stone of the tower floor, her arms around him, his face buried against her neck, and he was shaking so hard she could hear his teeth, and the journal fell from inside his robes and skidded away across the flags and lay open to the starlight, its pages riffling in the wind. Malfoy. She had her hands on either side of his head, trying to see his face. Draco, look at me. Look at me. I can't. His voice came out shredded. Both of them. I can't tell where the seam. He gasped. It's pulling them together. You were right. It's working. And it feels like... He couldn't finish. His fingers dug into her arms. It feels like dying and being born in the same breath. I can't. Then don't fight it, she said fiercely, holding his face, holding all of him. You've spent 2 years holding them apart. Stop holding. Let go. Both of you. Let go and choose. Choose this. Choose me. Choose to be one man. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. I want all of you. Do you hear me? I want the whole of you. So let go. And she felt him do it. She felt the exact moment he stopped fighting. The moment the two halves of Draco Malfoy, the steel and the boy, the daylight and the dark, the one she'd hated and the one she'd fallen for, stopped straining against each other and simply, finally agreed. The shaking peaked and broke. A long shudder ran the length of him and went out of him like a tide withdrawing. And then he was still, truly still, in a way she had never once seen him. Not rigid still the way the day self held himself, not the trembling stillness of the failing seam, but the deep, settled stillness of a thing that has finally come to rest in its own shape. The wind moved across the tower. The stars wheeled overhead, vast and indifferent and beautiful. And Draco Malfoy lifted his head from her shoulder and looked at her, and Hermione caught her breath because she did not need to ask whether it had worked. She could see it in his eyes. For weeks she had watched the two of them surface and sink across his face. The cold rising, the warmth rising, never both at once except in those brief, unbearable doorway moments. Now there was no surfacing and no sinking. There was only one man looking out at her, whole, the steel and the softness no longer at war, but folded into a single self, present in the same gaze at the same time. The flat grey was gone. So was the unspooling vulnerability of the night self, the rawness that had only ever come out in ink. What looked at her now was something new and something true. Guarded, yes, because he would always be guarded. The war had carved that into him too deep to ever fully smooth. But underneath the guard, reachable, a man you could touch and not lose. A man who was all of himself at once. "It's quiet," he said. His voice, she realized, was steady. Not the day's planned smooth chill, not the night's low ache. Just his, one voice. "Hermione, it's quiet. For the first time since the war, there's only one of me in here." She made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely, and pressed her forehead to his, and felt him let out a breath that fogged white between them in the cold. "You were right," he said, "about all of it. The seam wasn't going to heal from a spell. It needed..." He stopped, and she watched him reach for the word and find it. This man who had spent his whole life unable to say the true things in daylight, finding now that he could. It needed something both halves of me wanted enough to stop fighting over, and there was only ever one thing. He drew back just far enough to look at her. "You. It was always you. Both of me knew it. I just couldn't let the two of me know it at the same time, because if I did..." The corner of his mouth moved, and it was neither the day's sneer nor the night's hesitant near smile, but something whole, something rueful and warm and entirely his own. "Because if I did, I'd have to actually want it, out loud, in daylight, with my whole self, and wanting things where I come from is how you get them taken away." "Nobody's taking this away," she said. "No," he agreed, and there was wonder in it, as if he were only now beginning to believe such a thing were possible. "No, I don't think they are." She kissed him again, and this time there was no fire in the seam, no shaking, no terrible rushing together, because there was no longer any seam to catch. This time it was only a man and a woman on a cold tower under an enormous sky, kissing slowly, the way you kiss someone you have already decided to keep. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, sure now, no tremor in it, and she felt the warmth of him, steady and singular, and thought that she would never again have to wonder which of him she was touching. When they finally drew apart, the journal was still lying open on the flags where it had fallen, its pages turning in the wind. Draco reached for it. He looked at it for a long moment, the black leather worn soft, the thing that had kept the despised half of him alive, that had carried his truth to her in the dark when his daylight mouth could not. And then he held it out to her. "Here," he said. "You should have it. Both of us wrote ourselves into this thing trying to find you. It seems right that you keep the proof." She took it. The leather was warm from being kept against him. She did not open it. She did not need to. She knew what was written there. "There's still the rest," he said. The wind moved his hair. "The daylight. People are going to see us, see me, and they're going to remember exactly what I was, and they're not going to understand how you could..." He stopped. "It won't be simple. I'm whole now, but whole doesn't mean clean. I'm still the man who did the things I did. That doesn't go quiet just because the curse did." "I know," she said. I never thought it would be simple. I told you in the rain, steel and all. I meant it." She closed her hand around his, around the white knuckles and the silver ring, and the small healed line where it had once drawn blood. "We'll do the daylight together. That's the whole point, isn't it? You don't have to be one man in the dark and another in the sun anymore. You just get to be yourself, everywhere, and I get to be standing next to you when you are." He looked down at their joined hands, and then up at her, and on his face was an expression she had no name for, because she had never seen it on him before, and was fairly sure no one else ever had. The look of a man who has just been told, after a lifetime of believing otherwise, that he is permitted to be loved as he actually is. Below them, the castle slept its uneasy sleep, full of survivors learning to live. The clock in the dungeons ticked toward an hour that, for the first time in 2 years, would change nothing at all. The first morning of being one man was the strangest of Draco's life. He woke in his own bed, and the cold did not come. He lay very still beneath the green hangings, waiting for it. The old settling of ice behind the eyes, the planing smooth of every feeling into something safe to carry into daylight. And it did not come, and in its place was only the ordinary grey light of an ordinary morning, and the ordinary fact of being awake. No seam. No inheritance of a body rearranged by a stranger in the night. No memory arriving wrapped in an emotion he had no shelf for. There was only one of him now, and that one remembered the tower, and her mouth, and the journal warm from his ribs passing into her hands, and the remembering belonged to him entirely. He turned the silver ring on his finger out of habit, and then stopped, and looked at it, and took it off. He set it on the table by his bed. He did not need the bite of it anymore. He had spent 2 years using pain as the one feeling he could control. He found this morning that he no longer required a feeling he could control, because for the first time he was not afraid of the ones he couldn't. The daylight was, as he'd promised her, not simple. People remembered. Of course they did. He walked into the great hall whole for the first time, and the room did what it had always done. The small hush, the slid glances, the particular cold weather that followed him wherever survivors gathered, because he was the war-made flesh, the boy who had let them in, the mark still grey on his arm beneath his sleeve. None of that had changed. The curse had split his soul. It had not laundered his history. He was still the man who had done the things he'd done, and being whole only meant he now had to carry all of it in one set of hands, instead of dividing it between a self that performed the cruelty and a self that wept over it in the dark. But she was there. She did not make a performance of it. She did not march across the hall and take his hand for everyone to see, did not turn their understanding into a banner. She simply sat down across from him at the end of the Slytherin table one morning, with her books and her toast and her fierce ordinary concentration, in full view of a room that fell so silent he could hear the candles, and she said, "Good morning," as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and began to eat. It was the bravest thing he had ever seen anyone do, and she did it as though it cost her nothing, and it cost her a great deal, and he knew it, and he never forgot it. "You don't have to," he said, low, only for her. "Sit here, with them watching. You'll catch what's aimed at me." I know, she said, buttering her toast. I've thought about it. I've decided I don't care. She looked up at him, and her eyes were steady. I spent 6 years letting this room decide who you were. I'm done letting it decide who I sit with. She took a bite. Besides, someone has to teach them. They'll follow my lead eventually. People usually do. And the strange thing was, slowly, over weeks, in the grudging, incremental way that real things change, they did. Not all of them. Not quickly. There were those who would never forgive him, and he did not ask them to, and Hermione did not ask them to either, because some debts the war had left were not hers to forgive on anyone's behalf. But the daily venom of the room began, by degrees, to lose its certainty. Because the boy they remembered had been one thing, flat and cold and cruel, and the man who sat across from Hermione Granger every morning was visibly something else, quieter, harder to provoke, capable of a dry remark that made her laugh into her tea, capable of silence that was not contempt, but only thought. The whole of him was harder to hate than the half of him had been. Wholeness, it turned out, was its own kind of argument. They did not become, overnight, an easy thing. He had warned her of that on the tower, and he had been right. There were arguments, real ones, the kind that come from two stubborn, brilliant, badly wounded people learning to share the daylight. He could still be cold. The steel had not gone anywhere. It had only stopped being a wall and started being a part of him. And sometimes it came out edged before he could soften it. She could still be relentless, could press a point past the place where pressing helped, could mistake his silences for the old withdrawal, and meet them with a fierceness that took him a moment to understand was fear. But they fought now as one person to one person, not as a girl to a wall, not as a woman to two men who could not agree. And every argument ended the same way it had begun on the tower, with one of them reaching across the space, and the other, after a moment, reaching back. He learned to say the true things in daylight. It was the hardest lesson of his life, harder than the war, harder than the curse. The night self had been able to pour itself onto the page because the page was safe, because ink at midnight cost nothing. But to say a true thing aloud in the sun, to her face, where she could see him say it and he could not take it back, that was a muscle he had never been allowed to develop, and he built it slowly, clumsily, one sentence at a time. I was frightened. I didn't mean that the way it came out. I don't know how to do this, and I'm doing it anyway. I want you here. Each one cost him. Each one came easier than the last. One night, near the end of the year, they sat together in a window embrasure on the 7th floor, the rain writing its slow ferns across the leaded glass, the castle quiet around them. She had the journal in her lap. She carried it often now, not to write in, but simply to have the worn black leather a thing she liked the weight of. She ran her thumb along its spine. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Being two." The night self could say things the day self couldn't. I wonder sometimes if being whole means you lost the part of you that found me. "No," he said. He had learned to answer her quickly when the answer was certain. She needed that, he discovered, the speed of it, the proof that he wasn't weighing whether to tell her the truth. "The night self didn't find you, Hermione. I found you. The night could only say it because the day was asleep. Now I can say it awake. He took the journal from her lap and opened it to the first page, the page where the whole thing had begun, where in his grandmother's worn black book he had once written in the dark the only thing he'd been able to believe about himself. I am still here. And beneath it, in her hand, the answer that had saved him without either of them knowing. So am I, whoever you are. He took the quill from the spine loop. The rain ticked at the glass. And in Daylight's own steady hand, one hand now, one man, no seam, no fear of being seen, he wrote a third line beneath the two that had started everything. I know who you are now, he wrote, and I'm still here, in the sun, for good. He passed it to her. She read it, and her eyes went bright, and she did not bother to hide it, because she had taught him to say the true things, and the least she could do was let him see them land. For good, she repeated softly. For good, he said. Both halves of me were only ever trying to get to one place. I just didn't know, until you, that the place was a person. She set the journal aside. The rain came down, and she leaned across the small space in the window embrasure and kissed him. Slowly, the way she had kissed him on the tower, the way you kiss someone you have decided to keep. And this time there was no curse to break, and no seam to mend, and no second self to fear losing. There was only Draco Malfoy, whole and present and unafraid, kissing her back in the candlelight with his whole single heart, his hand sure against her face, the rain writing its quiet ferns on the glass, the war behind them, and the long ordinary daylight of a life ahead. When at last they drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers and breathed, and the breath came easy, and the silence between them was not the silence of a man holding two selves apart, but the deep, settled quiet of one man finally at rest in his own life. It's quiet, she murmured, echoing him, the words from the tower. It is, he said. And then, because he could now, because there was nothing left in him that needed to hide it, but never lonely, not any more. Outside, the rain eased. Somewhere far below, a clock ticked toward midnight, and past it, true all the way through, with no stutter and nothing to change. And in the window above, two people who had each spent the war learning to live as halves sat whole and together in the candlelight and did not let go. The cottage stood at the edge of a Wiltshire wood, far enough from the manor that its old cold could not reach, close enough that he had not run from his name entirely. Draco had learned the difference between fleeing a thing and setting it down. He had set a great many things down in the years since the tower. It was raining the morning he found her in the garden. He stood at the kitchen window with a cup going cold in his hand and watched her move along the herb beds in his old coat, the hem dark with wet, her hair coming loose the way it always did within an hour of her pinning it. She was arguing with a gnome. He could tell by the set of her shoulders. She lost the argument. The gnome bolted for the hedge, and she straightened and laughed at herself, alone, thinking no one watched, and the sound of it carried through the glass and undid something in his chest that he no longer bothered to defend. 5 years. He still woke some mornings braced for the cold to come, the old ice behind the eyes, the body handed over to a stranger in the night. It never did. There was only one of him now, and that one had grown used to the quiet, the way a man grows used to a house that has finally stopped settling in the dark. On the kitchen table lay the journal. She kept it there still, not to write in. They had no need of ink to reach each other anymore. He had learned slowly and at great cost to say the true things with his own mouth in daylight. She kept it because it was where they had begun. The worn black leather. The first page where a frightened boy had once written, "I am still here into the dark, certain no one would answer," and where a sleepless girl in a tower had written back, "So am I. Whoever you are." 3 lines under those now, in his own steady hand. "I know who you are now, and I'm still here, in the sun, for good." He had thought, when he wrote that it was a promise about himself. He understood now it had been a promise about a life. The door opened on a gust of wet air. She came in, stamping the rain from her boots, his coat far too big on her, her cheeks flushed with cold and argument. "The gnomes have organized," she announced. "I'm fairly sure they're holding meetings." He crossed the kitchen and took the wet coat from her shoulders, and his hands lingered the way they still did, because he had spent 2 years unable to touch her, and a lifetime before that unable to touch anyone without it being a thing he had to perform. Touch had become, for him, the truest language he owned. He pressed his mouth to her temple where the rain had caught in her hair. "Let them. We'll lose. We always lose to the gnomes. We do." He drew back enough to look at her. The years had marked them both. There was grey starting at his temple, fine lines at the corners of her eyes that came from laughing, and from the harder thing, from the war they both still carried in different rooms of themselves. He found he loved the marks. They were proof the time had been real. "You're soaked through." "I'm aware." "You'll catch your death." "I'm aware of that too." She tilted her head, studying him the way she had studied him in a library corridor a lifetime ago, searching his face. Except now she found every time exactly what she was looking for. One man. Whole, reachable. "You're doing the thing," she said softly. "The watching. You watch me like you still can't quite believe it." He considered lying and discarded it, because he had given up lying to her on a cold tower years before and had never found a reason to take it back up. "I can't," he admitted. "Some mornings I wake and I'm certain I dreamed all of it. The cure. You. This." He glanced at the small bright kitchen, the rain on the glass, the absurd ongoing war with the gnomes. "A man like the one I was doesn't get a morning like this. So I watch. To be sure, it stayed." "It stayed," she said. She put her cold hand flat against his chest, over the heart that had once been 2 and was now, finally, only 1. "It's not going anywhere. Neither am I. I told you that on the tower, steel and all. I meant it then, and I mean it now." He covered her hand with his. Outside, the rain wrote its slow ferns down the glass, the same script it had written on the windows of a castle when they were children learning to be enemies, and then learning against everything they had been built to be something else. "I never thanked you," he said. "Not properly, for wanting the whole of me, when there was so little of it worth the wanting." "You thank me every day," she said. "You just don't use words for it. You learned that part late, you know, the words." She smiled. "But you got there." "I got there." He bent and kissed her, slowly, the rain steady on the glass and the kettle beginning to sing and the gnomes regrouping somewhere in the hedge for their next campaign. There was no curse left to break. There was no seam to mend. There was only a man who had once been two halves of a frightened boy, standing whole in a small warm kitchen at the edge of a wood, kissing the woman who had refused to love only the easy parts of him. When they drew apart, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the single, steady, unhurried beat of it, and he held her in the grey morning light and was not afraid. Far off, the rain eased, the wood dripped and went still, and in a worn black journal on the kitchen table, 2 old lines and 1 newer one lay quiet in the morning light. I am still here, so am I. For good, needing no more added, because the rest of it was no longer written in ink. It was simply lived, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time.
Thank you for staying with this story until the end. I want to tell you why I wrote it. We all have two sides. One side we show to the world, the other side we keep hidden. Draco had this too, but for him the war made it real. By day he was cold, at night he was soft, and he could not be both at the same time. There is one scene I think about a lot. It is a part of the tower. He is shaking, he is afraid. He thinks he is too broken man. And Hermione looks at him and says, I want all of you. Not half, not the easy part, all of him. I love that moment because this we all want that. We want someone to see our whole self, the good and the bad, and stay. Draco did not need a magic spell to become whole. He needed someone to want the whole of him. That is the real cure. That is the real magic. So here is my small wish for you. I hope you find a person who wants all of you, and I hope you learn to show all of you too. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, of whole self. Good night.